This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Did you grow up in Stamford? Do you remember your parents or grandparents talking about the shops they went to back in the 40s and 50s? A new documentary highlights that era when family-owned businesses made up the city's vibrant core and how redevelopment in the 1960s pushed them out. It's called Remembering the Family Store, and we talked to the film's director and some Stamford residents featured in the documentary. That's coming up. First, tomorrow, August 9th, is the Connecticut primary. Will you be voting? The races to watch include 4 candidates competing in the Democratic and Republican primaries for Secretary of the State. There's the treasurer's race, where 3 candidates are vying for the Democratic vote. And which of the 3 Republicans running has the best chance to go up against US Senator Richard Blumenthal in November? The Connecticut Mirror's Mark Pazniokas joins us to break down everything you need to know about primary day. Mark is Capitol Bureau Chief for the Connecticut Mirror. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Our listeners can join as well, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Share a comment on Facebook or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. So, Mark, I just got back to Connecticut after a week in Vermont, and I know, and you know, plenty of people still out of town vacationing. Remind us why Connecticut has an August primary and how that impacts turnout.
Sure. It used to be in September, and the complaint then was September was too close to November, and that the winner of a primary would have insufficient time to rally the party behind them and go forward. So they opted for August, which has its own downsides, such as Lucy Nalpathanchel being out of the state.
I'm back.
And interestingly, I mean, the turnout from September to August has not been that different, at least in the times I've looked. But yeah, it's certainly a problem. August tends to be a sleepy time. And so there's been an effort to wake people up. I think Donald Trump contributed to waking people up, at least in the Republican primary, with a fairly dramatic phone call Thursday night out to Montville, Connecticut during a Republican cookout where I was in attendance chatting with people.
And having some good barbecue. So you mentioned that Republican cookout, the candidates running, Themis Claridis, Theora Levy, and Peter Lumage, Trump endorsing Levy. So what was the reaction, and does that endorsement make any difference so late in the campaign?
Well, so that's the question. Was there sufficient time and resources on the part of Leora Levy to fully capitalize on Trump's endorsement? Then there's the second and very important question of what weight that carries. Primaries in both parties tend to attract the people who are most passionate. So on the Democratic side, they tend to be more liberal than the average voter. On the Republican side, it tends to be the conservative base. So the conventional wisdom is a Trump endorsement is valuable. His record in all the primaries nationally has been mixed. He's had some big successes and some defeats. So that is part of the subtext here in Connecticut. Will the primary Tuesday now sort of be a gut check for Republicans about the identity of a party that's really been in transition for, the past several decades, about how conservative it is, how much in line with the national Republican agenda are Connecticut Republicans. In the General Assembly, they've kind of gone their own way. They had a string of successes, almost becoming even with the Democrats in 2016. And then the election of President Trump, it proved to be a disaster for Republicans. It really energized the Democratic base. Democrats won strong majorities in the General Assembly. And that's sort of where we are today. So that will be one of the interesting things on Tuesday. Leora Levy has been struggling for weeks, if not longer, to make this a 2-person race. You have Themis Claridis, who is a social moderate. She is a supporter of abortion rights. She voted for the Sandy Hook gun controls. She is a supporter of gay marriage, but she's also a fiscal conservative who, with Larry Cafaro before her, led the comeback in the House of Representatives in the General Assembly by Republicans. And, Levy has been trying to sort of push out Peter Lamage, who is another, like her, is another Trump loyalist and conservative. So Trump's endorsement Thursday night certainly helps brand Levy as the chosen one among conservatives, and that alone is a great help for her. Whether it's enough to put her up, over the top over Claridis, who was endorsed by the Republican Party at their convention and is endorsed by all types of Republicans in the General Assembly, conservatives and moderates. The Republicans this year have taken a rather pragmatic view. Even conservatives who disagree with Claridis on abortion or gun control have rallied behind her, saying, look, she is the one who has won elections over a 22-year period in the Naugatuck Valley in a swing district. She's the one with the political skills to take on Blumenthal, whose approval rating has dimmed this cycle, but he still has significant leads and significant advantages in a state that has been solidly blue for a long time when it comes to U.S. Senate and congressional races.
I should mention Themis Claridis is married to Greg Butler, who is on Connecticut Public's Board of Trustees. Wanted to get that out of the way, Mark. So when we think about this particular race and the August primary, what traditional turnout is, what's expected tomorrow?
Well, 4 years ago, the turnout was 31%. And 4 years ago, it was a pretty lively year. You had a five-way Republican primary for governor. You had 5 candidates who were spending significant funds trying to rev up the base. And the best they could do, again, was 31%. So that's really the question Tuesday. Do you do better than that, or is it going to be in the 20s? And I've got mixed signals talking to Republicans. Some say that due to President Biden's struggles, although that's certainly blunted a little bit by a very good weekend for the president. But, Republicans some Republicans say they feel a sense of opportunity, but there are several other Republicans who have told me, they're not seeing the concrete evidence of greater interest. And those metrics include things like how many absentee ballots have been taken out and returned. And, in different places, I'm told it's very low. I've talked to a registrar in Eastern Connecticut who said not much at all. And then somebody down in Fairfield County. So that does not bode well for a big turnout.
You're hearing Mark Pazniokas here on Where We Live. He's Capitol Bureau Chief at the Connecticut Mirror. As we talk about tomorrow's primary in Connecticut, you can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Can we talk about the 4th Congressional District race? So Jim Himes beating his Republican opponent pretty handily, but then there are 2 Republicans that are hoping to go against him in the fall. What can you tell us?
Sure. Republicans this year have largely succeeded in shedding their very bad habit of having nasty primaries in districts in which they have enough problems as it is trying to take out a Democratic incumbent. The exception this year is the 4th district of Fairfield County. Jamie Stevenson, the former first selectman of Darien, was the overwhelming choice at the convention to be their challenger against Jim Himes. Michael Goldstein, who has very few resources, but he's qualified for a primary, and he's hanging in there. Stevenson is favored. And again, this is not a district that offers great opportunities for Republicans, even though this was the last district won by a Republican. Chris Shays finally lost in 2008. He was the last Republican to serve in the House from Connecticut. It has become a solid Democratic district by many metrics. So, that does not look to be a pickup opportunity for the Republicans. Whatever happens.
When we think about the statewide races, there's Secretary of the State, which has generated a lot of interest since Merrill is retiring. There are 4 candidates total in both the Dem and GOP primaries. Can you tell us about them, Mark?
Yes, on the Democratic side, identity politics has really played a role. The Democrats have been very eager to further diversify their statewide tickets. The party, since 1962, has always had at least one person of color on the ticket. This year, they were looking to further diversify it. And in the Secretary of State's race, they're going to end up with a nominee who is a Black woman from Norwalk who won the endorsement, Stephanie Thomas, a one-term state representative, or Maritza Bond, who is a Latina from New Haven. She is the director of public health in the city. They agree on the basic issues about ballot access. They both favor early voting. They do not see the need for photo ID for voters. On the Republican side, you have two candidates who are leaning into President Trump's complaints about voter integrity, election integrity to varying degrees. You have the endorsed candidate is Dominic Rapini, who once chaired a group called Fight Voter Fraud. And then you have Terry Wood, who is a state representative from Fairfield County. And they both favor voter ID. Stephanie Thomas the other day said, look, that is a solution in search of a problem. There is scant evidence of in-person voter fraud, somebody impersonating someone else. But this has become one of the wedge issues between Democrats and Republicans. The GAO had a study years ago saying that this is really not a problem, but that if you do require photo ID, it does tend to hit minorities, poorer folks. In some parts of the country, it is not that easy to get a government photo ID if you are not a driver. So that's sort of, the dividing line in the Secretary of State's race between the Democrats and the Republicans.
On the Democratic side, there's also the state treasurer race with three candidates. Eric Russell has the party's endorsement, but tell us about his challengers, and has this been an interesting campaign?
Well, no, it hasn't. How's that? Again, this without a governor's race or a senatorial race at the top of the ticket, it's hard to get people excited about this. So the three candidates, again, we have to go to identity politics to a certain degree. Eric Russell is a Black man who, if elected, he would be the first openly gay Black statewide elected official, according to the Victory Fund, a national LGBT advocacy group. You have Karen Du Bois Walton, who is very well known in New Haven. She was the chief of staff to the former mayor. She chairs the housing authority. She chairs the state board of education. And then you have Dita Bhargava, who tried to run statewide office previously. She is of Indian descent. She has run, to my thinking, probably the most aggressive campaign. She has had some inventive ads trying to engage the Democratic base. She has made the case that the treasurer can be a player in various issues of social activism by using the state's pension funds to pressure corporations to be more progressive on how they treat their employees, how they provide reproductive services, how they pressure states where governments are curtailing abortion rights. So that has been an effort to try to excite people beyond the question of the very important work of who can return the best investment, return the best returns on the pension investments.
Right. Before we let you go, Mark, I don't want to forget to mention with the Connecticut assembly seats that are up this year. When we think about the primaries, two Pacific areas that are interesting, Bridgeport and West Haven. Can you tell us about those races?
Yes. It's a very quiet summer unusually quiet summer for primaries in the General Assembly. There are only 7, 6 in the House, 2 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and 1 in the Senate. Now, Bridgeport has 2 of the 7 primaries. You have Dennis Bradley, a state senator who is facing a criminal trial over allegations arising from campaign finance activities. And he was not endorsed. He is challenging the endorsed candidate, Heron Gaston, who is a clergyman and a Yale admissions officer. Jack Hennessy, a state rep from Bridgeport, has been in the legislature for 18 years. Democrats there have suggested it's time to move on. There's a fellow named Marcus Brown, who is a leader on the city council, who is the endorsed candidate. Probably the more interesting fight is in West Haven, or Trenae McGee, who's a young woman who was elected in a special election after Representative Michael DeMassa was forced to resign after his arrest on corruption charges. McGee is not unique, but unusual in the General Assembly. She is a young Black woman, a Democrat, opposed to abortion. The Democrats have sort of struggled with the idea of how big a tent they are when it comes to tolerance for people who are not in favor of abortion rights. She is challenged by a young man named Joe Miller, who is in favor of abortion rights. Both of them tell me this has not really become a proxy fight for the question of the Democrats' tolerance of diversity on abortion. There have been no outside groups going in trying to make this a bigger fight. So it's been a fight between the two of them, 2 young people. And they also point out that, they're also hearing about other issues, the issues you hear everywhere, inflation, cost of living, gas prices. And then, of course, in West Haven, there's the backdrop of the city's financial problems. They are under state oversight, and the corruption scandal that erupted last year.
So voters should definitely turn out when we talk about these specific races. So Mark Pazniokas, thank you for that preview. Again, we mentioned that turnout usually around 30%. Maybe it won't be as sleepy as we're thinking, but we appreciate the details you gave us on the races to watch tomorrow.
My pleasure, Lucy.
Mark is Capitol Bureau Chief for the Connecticut Mirror. You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. Coming up after the break, a new documentary explores the mom and pop shops in the city of Stamford from the 1940s to mid-1960s. It was produced by the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County to help viewers understand the city's legacy. We're going to talk to the film's director and some Stamford residents with ties to these family businesses. That's right after a short break. You can join us too. Find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today, the city of Stamford is known for its corporate headquarters and high-rises. It's one of the fastest-growing cities in America. In the 1940s, Stamford's downtown had a very different look, but it was still bustling, thanks to many family-owned businesses like Karp's Hardware and Grand Central Market. A new documentary produced by the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County takes a look back at this era, highlighting the people who were a vital part of Stamford's growth in the mid-20th century. Viewers also learn about the urban redevelopment in the 1960s that pushed many out of the city's core. Here's a preview from Remembering the Family Store.
He moved from 497 Main to Summer Street because of the development. He was a long-time resident, and he wanted the city to grow.
Redevelopment didn't affect us as adversely as it might have affected other businesses.
They owned the property, the building, and so that got sold. And then when they sold, got moved over from Pacific Street, they went over to Hamilton Avenue. And that stayed in business for a while.
My father's business was affected enormously when urban renewal came, and he knew that he had to move.
We lost some character, I don't know, some personality that was lost in the transition.
Wise's paint store ended when Pacific Street ended. And they destroyed the core center of Stamford, Connecticut.
Those were some of the voices of Stamford business owners and the children of former owners of mom and pop shops featured in that documentary, Remembering the Family Store. Joining us now on Zoom is Gail G. Trell, who's a production coordinator for the film, and she's past president of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. Gail, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here.
And I should mention you're a lifelong resident of Stamford, Connecticut.
Yes, I was born here. My father was born here. My grandparent and great-grandparent were also here.
So this film must mean a lot to you, Gail, as a Stamford native. The film highlights or spotlights 24 businesses, and I understand that the project started thanks to a collection of photographs. What can you tell us?
Yes, it started with Lester Charlack, who collected photos and saw a potential for having a story. So he collected all these photographs and made a slide presentation, and he went from group to group, church to organization, and told the story as the pictures went along. And so the results of those presentations was excitement from the audience that we said, why don't we make a documentary?
Margaret Stapor Costa is with us. She's director of the film Remembering the Family Store and owner and president of Aries Productions. Margaret, welcome.
Nice to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
So you got involved and you've interviewed a lot of people for the film. So tell us about that time in Stamford, what downtown looked like, and a little bit about the families that owned those stores.
In total, I interviewed 34 individuals over, it initially was just 2 sessions within a month of each other, 2019, 2020. Then with COVID, we were able to, everything got put on hold. Obviously, the whole world got put on hold. I was able to interview more people. And interviewing so many people, there was just such a camaraderie of these business owners, children, grandchildren of the business owners that reflect on that time in Stamford just so fondly about how it was truly such a community. Everyone looked out for everyone. And everyone, there was competition, but everyone just tried to help each other out. And if someone had a diner, business owners would come to the diner, and then if the diner needed an appliance, they would go to one of the local businesses to buy the appliance. So I was just really struck by just the kindness and the camaraderie of all these business owners during that period of time in Stamford.
It's also a nice reminder watching the film about how so many of these businesses are immigrant owned, and quite a diversity of business owners and people that were in downtown Stamford in that era, Margaret.
Yeah, I mean, the immigration and post-World War II development of Stamford was remarkable, and the diversity that was in downtown Stamford was truly amazing. One person described it as a melting pot, and it truly was.
Gail, you said that your family has been in Stamford for a long time. So name a couple of the businesses when you look back and you hear stories about some of the shops and the relationships that these owners had with people in the city.
Well, I certainly learned much more than I thought I knew from watching the film. I knew many of these places. Frank Martin Clothing. My father went shopping there. We had Grand Central Market, where we would have gone shopping. The fish market down on Pacific Street. I'm sure my mother was there. We were friends with the Kramer's Fabric. I knew that family well. I knew the Karp stationery very well. So I was, this whole film brought the world alive.
We're talking about Remembering the Family Store. It's a documentary about Stamford from the 1940s through mid-1960s. With us on Zoom is Gail G. Trell, production coordinator for the film, and Margaret Stapor Costa, who is director of the documentary. You can join us if you're a Stamford resident, if you have memories of that time or know of the shops from hearing your parents or grandparents talking about what Stamford's downtown what it looked like back then. You can join us as well, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. And when we think about that core, Margaret, and the streets that were profiled where these businesses were, Pacific and Main, Bedford and Lower Summer Street, can you talk more about, how big of an area this was and, the people that even came into Stamford because of these shops?
The area, I would say it was so big. It was, from my knowledge, just by doing the film, the stores, the streets, they were all intertwined with each other. And it was the downtown area. And it was amazing. I found when I was doing research, a lot of maps that the city have. And you could just see, and the maps were in the film, just how, Main Street went into this street and Bedford Street went into that street. So it was a very consolidated downtown area. And I do believe that people from, surrounding areas did do a lot of their shopping in this downtown store area. It was a very well-known area that people flocked to.
Gail, did you want to add to that? A lot of New Yorkers heading to a specific street where there were some clothing shops and what was known for fashion?
Were they known for fashion? Sure, we did have some clothing shops, because not only the people that were interviewed, but we have tons of photos showing up in the film that we didn't have time to highlight specifically, but we show them in the film. People came to Stamford also to the movie theaters, because we were showing all the first run movie theaters, and our documentary is being shown at the Avon, which is one of the theaters that still exists. And were we able to mention that people who want to see this film, it's showing on August 24th and August 29th at the Avon?
That's right. And we have information about that on our website, Gail, ctpublic.org/where we live. Margaret, did you want to add to some of the streets that were notable during that time?
Well, to me, Pacific Street was the street. Everyone that spoke about Pacific Street just said that was the street. I don't think I met one person who I interviewed that did not reference Pacific Street. They may not have had that soundbite included in the documentary, but everyone spoke about Pacific Street. I didn't grow up in Stamford, but I feel like I could walk down and identify every building on Pacific Street, all the local businesses. So I think Pacific Street was the dominant street that just contained every kind of business you can imagine. And as one of the people I interviewed said, when Pacific Street ended, like that whole part of Stamford kind of ended with it.
Right. So a vibrant area, and then urban renewal, which we saw happening across the country in the mid-1960s. What happened to the city's core, Margaret?
Well, urban renewal, I found was just such an interesting concept because, as you mentioned, it was happening across the country. And the businesses in Stamford, if I interviewed 34 people, half of them said it was the worst thing that ever happened to Stamford, and the other half said, well, we didn't like it, but it made Stamford what it is today. A lot of people heard the rumblings that urban redevelopment was coming, and they made plans to figure out how to save their stores. Other people just couldn't regroup, and they, really suffered, and their businesses ended. So it was just such a very interesting time, what happened to a lot of these businesses, and what people did to survive, and how many businesses, like Wise's Paint, David Weiss said in your opening, Wise's Paint ended when Pacific Street ended. So it was, in a lot of ways, great for Stamford, But when you speak to the people whose livelihoods and businesses that they spent their lives developing, redevelopment ended those businesses. There is a sadness to it.
Right. Gail, another part of the film that I thought was important to highlight is when we think about the people who also lived in this part of the city, including African Americans, and once urban renewal started and eminent domain removed these businesses and apartments, they were displaced as well.
Yes, that was one of the downsides and the heartbreak for many of the people who live there, because all the stores that were on Pacific Street and Atlantic Street, they had apartments above the stores. So when the stores and the street had to be demolished to build, well, what turned out to be the Stamford Town Center, they had to find other places to live. And it was upheaval. It was disappointment. It was tragic for many.
Yes, and to add to that, there is a section in the film that spoke about how many families were being evicted during the whole redevelopment process, and that the Black community had a lot of protests because a lot of their housing was being taken away. And there is a section in the film, as you know, Lucy, from watching it, where it describes the protests that were going on in Stamford regarding these evictions that were occurring.
Yeah, and many of them ended up having to relocate to the city of Bridgeport. Gail, I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the businesses that remained that the city was not able to move through eminent domain. Can you share those with us?
So, let me ask that question. Ask the question one more time, please.
There's some businesses that remained despite urban renewal and the city's eminent domain that prevailed against being moved from that area.
Well, some of the stores were in the right place, like Wolf's Cleaners. They did not have to move. They are still there. They still are existing. We had downtown. We also have a few other places that are still in existence. Our Gallagher's Funeral Home. Grand Central Market is now GNP. Curly's is still here.
That's the diner?
That's the diner. We just know it as Curly's so vividly. Of course, we have Thomas Bradford speaking about his barbershop that wasn't affected. But Karp's Hardware moved and now is Rocky's. So let me see what else we have.
I think that's
here.
a good list, Gail. Margaret, when you obviously did a lot of research and interviewed a lot of people for this film, what are some takeaways that you want to leave our listeners with?
That the community of Stamford, whether you go back to the 40s or you now fast forward to present day, just a great community full of wonderful, wonderful people that really appreciate their city and their neighbors and their community. I'm, as I said, I'm not from Stamford, but I feel now like I am, just because I've met so many wonderful people. And it's a fabulous history. I would encourage anyone that's interested in history per se, or specifically Stamford, Connecticut's history, to come out and see the film, because it really is a representation of how the community was and is today.
That's right. And you can get more information at our website for the film being shown at the Avon Theater later in August. Our website, ctpublic.org/wherewelive. Thanks to Margaret Stapor Costa, director of the documentary Remembering the Family Store. Appreciated you coming on the show, Margaret.
Thank you so much for having me.
And also here with us, Gail G. Trell, production coordinator for the film and past president of the Jewish Historical Society of Fairfield County. Gail, I learned a lot from the film. Thank you, and to your members for the production.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be here.
Coming up after the break, we're going to hear from two people featured in the documentary, Remembering the Family Store. You can join us too, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Remembering the Family Store, it's a new documentary that highlights the era when family-owned businesses in the 1940s and 50s made up Stamford's vibrant core, and how redevelopment in the mid-1960s pushed many of them out. Two people featured in the film join us now. First on Zoom, Steve Karp, who's a lifelong Stamford resident, and he narrated Remembering the Family Store. Steve, welcome to the show.
Good morning, Lucy. Nice to be here.
So we learned a little watching the film about Grandpa Harry. Tell us about him and your family's businesses back then.
Well, Grandpa Harry was a very colorful character in Stamford, but he was the first of three generations of Karps. At least my family of Karps. There are a whole lot of Karps in Stamford, Connecticut, and many of whom had businesses of their own. But my grandfather, Harry, originally started a newspaper and cigar business that morphed into a toy store, that morphed into a stationery store, and finally morphed into an office furniture and supply business. And but that was by the third generation is when that happened.
And the businesses remained open until the 1980s?
It did, actually. The business was sold in 1982. However, my brother, and he really is part of that third generation, continued the business under a different name. And we fortunately owned the building that our business was located in. And he was able to successfully run the business pretty much right through, I think it was 2007.
What do you remember about that time when the store was still owned by your family? Did you work there as a kid?
I did. I was a delivery boy, and I loved it. I worked there during the summers, and I loved delivering stationery and help lug some of that office furniture upstairs to various offices, and we had some very interesting adventures doing that. Sometimes the desks didn't fit through the door, and we had to be very creative in how to get them to get into the office.
I mentioned you narrated this documentary, and so learning about these other families and their connections to Stamford, how did you feel when you saw the whole story put together in this film?
Well, having grown up in Stamford, I should say that my participation in the film was really because of Gail Trell. She likes Gail G. Trell. She's very fastidious about that G. But in any case, Gail and I grew up together in Stamford, and she knew that I was in the theater business and invited me to participate in this film. There were three stages to this project, and the first was simply a projection of photos, but the second was a presentation of these photos, and my job was to add verbal descriptions of these stores, blurbs really, and there were about 150 of them, and all of that tended to, when we did the film, morph into my narration of the film. So the live presentation was kind of background for me to learn about these stores, even though I knew myself about them, having grown up in the city. But the narration actually came out of the original work done for the live presentation.
Nostalgia for that era?
Oh, absolutely. The movie is really kind of a walk down memory lane, which is not to say it's Pollyannish by any means, because it's a very honest film and hits hard at why these stores didn't survive, but nostalgic because it was a time of trusting. People trusted. People were more open. There was a mutual dependence in the community. People, if they didn't know each other directly, knew of people and knew of their reputations. It was a time that you can find that time today, but it's scarce. It's hard to find life the way it was back then. But the movie actually has, I think, a universal appeal and relevance, because every city and town across the country has morphed from small businesses to the mall. The mall actually has become the dominant retail location, I think, in most cities around the country.
And the mall that has many vacancies and needed to be rethought of after a lot of shops closed. That's the Stamford Town Center. You're hearing Steve Karp here on the show, narrator of Remembering the Family Store, looking back at mom and pop shops from the 1940s through mid-60s in the city of Stamford. For another perspective, on the phone with us is Thomas Bradford, who's featured in the film, and he's a barber based in Stamford. Thomas, welcome to the show.
Oh, yes, I'm here.
Welcome to the show, Thomas. You're live on the air with us. I loved hearing about what brought you to Stamford from South Carolina. I guess you were recruited to work at a barber shop. So tell us a little bit about that shop.
Well, I was young then, you might say, in school, barber school and everything, and it just so happened that someone needed a barber in Connecticut, which I'd never been here before. And being young, you want to travel and see different places. So when I was asked, I accepted the job. So when I came to Stanford, it was hard for me to get used to people, and I came to like the town. So when I got the job, and the people liked me. That's how a barber is. A barber get hooked into everybody. You like a community person. You know the city, people, and places, everything. And I enjoyed it. And that's how I wound up getting there, here in Stanford, and getting to know people here.
I understand that you have a daughter who now works in your barber shop. Can you tell us about her?
Well, I have two of them work here. One thing, my oldest son didn't want to be a barber. He stopped acting for regulation industry. But the two daughters used to cut hair, and I guess they sort of took after their father. The younger one came in first. And the older one, she was like cutting everybody hair around. So I told her, I said, I want you to get her and get your license, come on in and join us. And she did. And that was years ago, and the two of them still actually, they practically run the place because they always asked, they go, they said, no, Pop, you'll be right. Yes, I'm like her. And she wants to them, I guess, they like for me to give them that little self-respect and back up or whatever. So we all like cutting hair. We all like, and the people love us. That's the main thing with a barber. If people like you, the church, everywhere, the community likes you. You're a community person. You're a barber.
And Thomas, Thomas, for our listeners who don't know your shop and the city of Stamford, tell us where your barber shop is located now.
It's on the west side. It's right next to Bank of America on the west side. If you go up the hill, it's right at the top of the hill, right on where West Main Street and Richmond here meet. My barber shop is just on the other side of there, right in that corner, right there. You did it fine.
Well, Thomas, it's been good to hear from you, and glad to know that your business is still going strong despite a lot of the changes in downtown Stamford. Steve, you're still with us. When we think about the shops that did close or had to move, we think about how cities can lose their character, even though Stamford is one of the fastest growing cities today, and a lot of people see that as a positive. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, it's as I think Marge and Gail talked about, there are people in the community who like what happened in terms of Stamford's development into this huge corporate headquarters city. And there are those who are not so keen on it. And I think the people who are not so keen on it are the people who have grown up in Stamford and remembered Stamford as being smaller and simpler and, again, more open and trusting. And when things like, or values like loyalty were important, particularly in business between a customer and a store owner. You know, these things, again, you can find them today, but they're more scarce than they used to be. And I think people who grew up in Stamford kind of are nostalgic for the old days. And it's kind of what the film presents. And it does take you back. And which is not to say that all has been bad in Stamford in terms of its growth and development. Corporations have been terrific in terms of providing employment and also financially helping a lot of the nonprofit organizations in Stamford, including my own theater called the Stamford Theater Works. But the development has mixed emotions among the people in the community.
Mm. When you drive around Stamford, the downtown area today, Steve, what do you think about in terms of, the footprint that is there now?
Well, it is interesting because right in the mall, right in the center of the mall, is where my grandfather's store used to be. Yeah, this whole urban redevelopment process knocked down all of these family businesses and was replaced essentially by the mall. And the mall spanned a good deal of the downtown Stamford. And but when I go into the mall, I can't help but think at a particular location in the mall, this is exactly where Karp's was located. Karp's being the toy store at the time. And you look around the community of the mall and other stores that exist, and you can't help but think, well, this is where that store was. This is where that one was. And you kind of imagine the interaction that goes on amongst the store owners and the customers. It's quite fun, actually, to do that.
Well, you've been hearing Steve Karp here on the show, narrator of Remembering the Family Store, also a lifelong Stamford resident. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about your family's history in the city of Stamford, Steve.
Thank you, Lucy. Pleasure to be here.
And also thanks to Thomas Bradford, who joined us by the phone. He's a barber based in Stamford, Connecticut. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Today's show produced by Where We Live, senior producer Tess Terrible, with help from talk show intern Anya Grandolski. Thanks to Jean Amatruda, who's our tech director today. And coming up tomorrow, we're going to talk about how racial disparities in maternal health care are being addressed in light of Roe versus Wade's overturning. We're going to hear from Connecticut nurse midwife Dr. Lucinda Canty, who recently founded Lucinda's House to help local women of color and to address severe maternal morbidity. We hope you join us.